Okay. Good evening, everyone. We are very fortunate today to have two authors to speak about The Long March Home, Marcus Brotherton and Tosca Lee. They co-authored this really fascinating book, and we are going to hear a little bit about how the book came about, how they collaborated, and then, they may have to be able to share some insights about their writing, and then we'll have some time to ask questions. So, Marcus or Tosca, whoever would like to start. Okay.
It's great to be here with you tonight, virtually anyway. This book started approximately 12 years ago, maybe 13 years ago now, and it's been a long journey, and finally the book is out, and it's receiving some great reviews, and we're just so thrilled to connect people with the subject matter. The book actually began even longer ago than that. In 06, 07, 08, I was collaborating on a book with Lieutenant Buck Compton. And Buck Compton was one of the original Band of Brothers. He lived about 45 minutes from my house, and his attorney knew my agent, and we got connected to write his memoirs. And so we wrote his memoirs. It was called Call of Duty. The book came out as a national bestseller. And after Buck's book came out, Buck traveled all over. He was 85, 86 years old, and he was still traveling and speaking. But he needed a traveling partner. And so his daughter phoned me up, and we knew each other quite well by then. And she said, "How would you like to travel with my dad? Just kind of help him navigate airports." And I jumped at the chance. And so Buck and I ended up going on a number of trips together. And he had a very clear memory for being 86 years old. He could remember minute details of what had happened during World War II. And we were sitting in an airport lounge one day, and he was talking about Bastogne. I don't know if you've seen Band of Brothers, it's just on Netflix right now. Bastogne was this horrible winter battle, minus 30 degrees below zero. Troops were outgunned, outmanned, not enough food, getting shot at, just horrible conditions. And so Buck was telling me about Bastogne in this airport lounge, and I remarked very sincerely, I said, "Boy, that just must have been so horrible, so difficult for you." Buck stopped at that point and he said, "Yeah, it was hard, but at least I wasn't fighting in the Pacific." He said, "Man, those guys had it rough." So that began this big question for me. What was Buck Compton talking about? This guy who had fought through the Battle of the Bulge, relatively speaking, to compare the battles in the Pacific to what he had been through, and for him to say, those guys had it rough. And that's what started this whole process of research and discovery, and really wanting to bring this subject matter to people.
And how did Tosca get involved with this?
So about 2017 or so, Marcus called me up, and I knew Marcus because I was familiar with his World War II biographies, but I was also familiar with a novel he had written called Feast for Thieves, which I endorsed actually a few years prior to that. And so Marcus called and said, "Hey, I'm working on this project. It's about World War II in the Pacific and three best friends who become part of the Bataan Death March." And I didn't know very much about what went on in the Philippines. I kind of had a little bit of an idea about the Pacific from movies, but he said, "Would you like to join me in this project?" And I said, "Yeah." And so I ended up adding 5 years to that process. So Marcus had been working on it off and on in between other projects for 7 years. So that's why this is a book 12 years in the making. So that's how I became involved in the project. And should I tell you a little bit about the actual book, about the book itself? It's right here, this beautiful cover. And so this is the story of three best friends, Jimmy, Hank, and Billy, and their fourth best friend, who you can see kind of captured on the back, which I really love.
Oh boy.
And it's their story of growing up in Mobile, Alabama. This story does feature a dual timeline. So every now and then we take a break from the war and we go back in time to see these three boys as they're growing up and coming of age and doing all the things that kids do. And but it begins with them in the Philippines, having enlisted in the army and having been stationed there. And life actually seems really great for them. They're in Manila and the dollar goes far and anything you could ever want is there. And it's great for them until December 8th of 1941, which is when just 10 hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Philippines was also bombed and plunged into war. So that is the story of their lives during that war and during the Allied surrender in April the following year, and also of their involvement in the march and what their life is like as POWs after that. Marcus, do you have any more to add? What I forget?
How did we get connected and why did it work? I think is a question we get asked a lot. After talking with Lieutenant Compton and getting this big story idea, what happened in the Pacific, I actually did an oral history project with a historian, Adam Makos, called Voices of the Pacific. And we went and interviewed veterans who were still alive at the time and fought in the Pacific. And I love oral history. I think it's one fantastic way of connecting readers with veterans, and it's kind of like having them sit on your porch and sipping a glass of sweet tea or whatever, and stories directly. The one problem with oral history is it's not an immersive experience, and a book like a good plunge you into part of the action. And with oral histories, you kind of get stories, but you don't get this immersive experience. And so I really wanted to go beyond the oral history and create a novel that plunged readers straight in. So that's when I began working on Long March Home. And as Tosca said, it was an unfunded project at the start. It was just a passion project. And I felt this compulsion to get the story out there. And I chipped away at it little by little for 7 years. And I finally had a good working manuscript. And I showed it to my agent, and he said, I think you're trying to do too many things. You know, you're covering 5 to 6 years of the war and before and after, and you're probably just too close to the canvas at this point because you've been working on it for so long. Why don't you get a collaborator? And that way you'll be able to bat ideas back and forth together, and you can bring this manuscript home. Fiction, I think, is almost it's almost a more competitive world than nonfiction. I mean, nonfiction is difficult, it's competitive, but with fiction, there's just so many novelists and novels out there. You've really got to bring everything you do from an A to an A plus. And so that's when I called Tosca. And I had read a number of books of hers over the years. I knew her as a writer. I really liked the way she wrote and the way she thought. And so I called her and said, hey, how about working on this with me? And she graciously said yes. So we began this process. Tosca wanted to do her own research just to kind of double check everything that I had done and also to immerse herself in the subject matter. And so she began a really in-depth process of jumping in and everything checked out. And so she got this really good grasp of the history. And then she began to straighten out the plot, and the characters were there. And finally, we got a good working manuscript that we began to work on together. She would send me drafts, I would work on them, and I would send drafts back to her. And this went on for quite a while, and finally we got it consistently into one voice, and everybody was happy. Will sometimes ask us, did we ever fight? I don't think we ever did. We had some excellent heated conversations every now and again, and we each came into the process with a sense of non-negotiables, like I really love this character, or this paragraph has got to stay, or even this one line here. Let's fight hard to get this one line in. But we're also really flexible with each other, and we collaborate. There's a lot of back and forth, and a lot of just a lot of good grace in the world to respect each other's talents and recognize that you're working in a partnership. So
And a
finally,
lot of
we got
joking. We
and a lot
joke
of
a lot.
joking.
But you have to do, you have to have a good sense of humor, not just to write together, but just to be in this industry. And, we've been doing this both a long time. So you have to have a good sense of humor if you're going to be a professional writer, I think.
Now, where did you get the detail of your information from?
So there's a lot of research for one. There's Marcus is the only one out of the two of us who has talked to actual survivors. For me, when I started jumping in, I read a lot of survivor accounts, and there's an excellent book. You can your library probably has it. It's called Death March by Donald Knox, Knox, which has some fascinating first-person accounts. There's also, so many of the survivors never spoke about their experiences and what happened. And we've received mail from numerous people who have said, my dad, my grandpa, my uncle, they never spoke about what happened over there. And one reader wrote and said, my dad never spoke, and now I know why. And so there's so many that never talked about it, but there's also a certain number of survivors who took it upon themselves later in life to write their memoirs and self-publish them, and they're just incredible. My local library, I'm in rural Nebraska, so my local library is very small, but my local library has a handwritten manuscript by a survivor that there's only the one copy. And the detail in those is just absolutely amazing. And one of those survivors was a guy named Joe Johnson, and Marcus was involved in writing. Well, what would you call that? He had done a self-published version, but then his estate, his family wanted to put that out there in a more professional way, and so Marcus was the writer on that, and it's called A Bright and Blinding Sun. And the detail in that, I'm talking for you, Marcus, now. The detail in that let me just talk about your book for you. The detail in that gentleman's story is absolutely astounding. I mean, from he talks about the details of the barracks to what it was like for him being on the march and being a POW. And he was only 14 when he enlisted.
Oh.
Joe Johnson was. So, Marcus, you can talk about your book now.
I regularly sift through unpublished memoirs. There's nothing I like more than a really good obscure World War II manuscript that sort of sits dusty in a pile for years and years and years, and nobody ever reads it. And then one day it's discovered and brought to light. So that's what happened during COVID. 2020, I had hunkered down, as many of us had done, with a stack of good books. And far down deep in the pile, there was this obscure manuscript written by Joe Johnson. And Joe had been he'd enlisted when he was 14 years old, and it was actually before Pearl Harbor when he enlisted. And he enlisted just because life at home was kind of hard, and he thought he was going to get 3 square meals and a warm bed at night, and that's why he went into the Army. So he had fibbed about his age and sworn on a stack of Bibles that he was 18 when in fact he was only 14. Managed to make it in. He got sent to the Pacific. Pearl Harbor hits. The attack on the Philippines happens. Young Joe Johnson, who's 15 by then, gets thrust into this horrific battle. He fights for a number of months, and then Tam Peninsula falls. Joe has made it over to the small island of, or just off the coast of Bataan. He fights for one more month, and then Corregidor falls. And so Joe finds himself this teenage POW at the hands of Japan. True story. And so I read Joe's original manuscript and reached out to the estate just to convey my thanks to Joe, had passed away by then. And his estate said, "Hey, we recognize your name. Would you like to bring Joe's story to a wider audience?" So I was instrumental in rewriting that story and digging into Joe's life. A fascinating experience. He had left a number of tapes and videotapes and audio recordings, a journal, plus a big box of emails that were hard copies and photographs. And so he had really just left a wealth of information and very detailed, very lyrical descriptions of what he had been through. And so he just helped bring it home to me as well. Just the fact that real people did do this and helped fight for our freedom. So
For me, the Joe's story, his original self-published manuscript was really instrumental in why I felt that the boys in our book needed to be stationed, needed to be part of the 31st Infantry, which is what Joe was in, because the detail was just so rich that we were able to bring our fictional story to brighter life because of details from a story like Joe's, where he talks about the bougainvillea that grew near the barracks and the big bay windows. And he even talked about the kinds of things they would eat and be served for meals before the war. So yeah, it's stories like that that give us the detail to make the story come to life for our readers, even though we're writing fiction. Everything that happens to the three guys and the three main characters in our story happened to somebody. So we've quilted together experiences from all kinds of soldiers who were there.
Was the shooting of the mayor, the kill that they were tasked to do, was that part of any of the original men's memoirs?
yeah, that surely happened. Maybe not as we portrayed it exactly, but we did discover in actually Donald Knox's book that the mayor was two guerrillas, two Allied soldiers were sent on a mission to execute the mayor of Santa Rita, and by the time they got to him, already been executed by somebody else. And so this day, nobody quite knows the story of who killed the mayor of Santa Rita. So this was our attempt to offer a plausible solution to that.
And there is a
Fascinating mystery.
historical figure in the book too. There's a female freedom fighter in the book named Philippa Kulala, who's somebody that Marcus had discovered, and she's real. So and she's not unique in that, because there were more women fighting to defend their country during that time while the men were at war or in POW camps.
Yeah, I found this fascinating. Here was this female guerrilla fighter who was roaming around the countryside and waging her war, her own war in sort of these various clandestine ways. And she was a real person and not the only one. So yeah, Philippa Kulala was, she died before the end of the war. Her own troops accused her of financial impropriety and they executed her. But for a while, she was quite a force to be reckoned with. So
the wars today are so very different, and they're fought so differently. And I suppose there are some that would say, why don't you write about Iraq or Afghanistan or the such? What do you think the sort of meaning or lesson from your book is for today?
I think and Marcus might have a totally different answer from me, but I think that World War II is so personal to so many families because so many families had family members who fought in that war. And I think that it's important. I mean, we remember Iraq, but there's stories from World War II that are not getting passed down because the survivors didn't talk about it. And we understand and hear often much more about the European theater than we hear about the South Pacific, for instance. And, you know, the things that get remembered are the ones that get told. And so I think for me, that was the allure of telling this story. Yeah, for me, that was the allure. Marcus, what about you?
Were you responsible for a lot of Claire's feelings and the whole her love life with all the guys?
I was responsible for a lot of the war. There's this funny thing where this is my second collaboration with a man, and it's funny because there's often the assumption that women write the emotional parts and men write the gory parts, when in fact we both wrote both. So yeah.
Yeah, just and getting back to Carolyn's question as well. And so I have done some books with veterans from modern wars as well. I worked with Colonel Susan Buzz on her book, The Nightingale of Missoula. I worked with Staff Sergeant Travis Mills on his book, Tough as They Come. He's a quadruple amputee. And so, yeah, absolutely. There's a sense that we want to shine the spotlight on troops who are doing admirable and noble things. You know, in recent years, there's always I think an overall theme in my writing that war is bad, and there's no sort of nice way of saying that. War is horrific. We want to avoid war sort of at all costs. Never forget the horrors that war produces, and the war in the Pacific is one of the worst, to put it that way. It's funny because when you know, if you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat it, as the age-old classic saying goes. We often hear rumblings in the some leader will come to power, whether it's overseas or even domestically, and they'll sort of get upset about some big conflict, and sort of war is talked about as kind of the first resort, where it really needs to be the last resort, and way down the list. There's sometimes even this sense of esprit de corps. You know, our boys are going to go up against their boys, and whoa, we'll really give them hell. We're really going to whip them. And people talk about war almost like it's a football game, you know. And so we really have to remember this is what war is like, and let's do everything we can to never do it again. I mean, we're a civilized people in modern society. Surely we work out our conflicts without killing each other, and that's one of the big reasons that I think military nonfiction and fiction is so important. Remind people what war is truly like.
How did you feel? I mean, as I was reading the book, the fact that MacArthur had abandoned all these people on the Philippines, I mean, that just was so cruel. And it just made me think that America's government is just still, it has been inefficient, and it still remains inefficient, and how it could abandon so many people. I mean, there were so many Filipinos that were killed, and our own soldiers. I mean, it's despicable.
Yeah, I think we have to remember as well that America was not a superpower at the start of World War II. And so Pearl Harbor happens, most of the American fleet is wiped out. And here are our guys in the Philippines, and they're outgunned, outmanned, and there's no chance of getting resupplied because they can't get ships to them to get them more manpower, weaponry, more food even. So yeah, so Douglas MacArthur makes this decision to some would say escape to Australia, and some would say abandon the troops in the Philippines and go and get out of there. So it's highly debatable to this day what was the actual motivation. Some who were are MacArthur supporters say, look, MacArthur was a figurehead, and we had to keep morale alive, and we had to keep a a really great general alive, and so that's why we had to get him out of there by PT boat and take him to Australia. Others say, dug out Doug, he abandoned the troops. So it is a point of contention today, and it's sort of the debate continues. What I do know is that history has shown that General Jonathan Wainwright, who was left in charge, proved to be an extremely capable leader, far surpassing sort of everybody's what everybody had thought for him. General Wainwright at that time, he was the hill. That was thought about him. He liked to tip a cork. He liked to drink, and sent to the Philippines sort of as a here's your last stop before retirement, and then Pearl Harbor hit. So here's Jonathan Wainwright. Nobody expects much from him at all, and yet he rallied the troops, made very difficult calls, even to surrender, extremely difficult call, and in the field really looked to him as their hero. Could have been actually court-martialed because he surrendered without direct executive order. But by the time the war was all over, came home to a ticker tape parade, bigger than MacArthur's. So I would love to see a fresh telling of General Wainwright's story someday.
He's the first one he gave up his horse first too when they started needing food. And he had this special horse. I think the horse's name was Conrad or something like that. And it was a highly expensive horse. And when things got bad and the half rations and quarter rations kicked in, he was the one who gave his horse to be butchered.
He was the first to pull the trigger to kill his horse. And General Wainwright, this high-ranking officer, went through the POW camps with his men, which says a lot of him as well.
Mm-hmm. I think part of why we hear so little about this particular war in the Philippines is because there was no real big victory there for those who were POWs. It became a waiting game, and it didn't end for them until the war ended.
Yeah, it's one of the themes there that is a little bit debatable, but I think it's accurate to say that the action in the Philippines produced a delaying action. And so the troops ended up fighting for about 5 months here. And what that did, when you study Imperial Japan had actually hoped to sort of sweep down the coast and on to Australia and sort of claim all of the Pacific Rim, at least that side of things, for their own. And so the fact that the Filipino troops and the American troops fight for as long as they did helped stop that advance. And it gave America back at home a chance to kind of collect themselves and catch their breath and say, look, flat-footed, now we've got to ramp up production in this game because we're in this game. And so that helped really the industrial complex to begin producing tanks and planes and whatnot that eventually helped swing the tide of the. So did the troops in the Philippines do any good? There's a good case to be made for saying that they.
Was there a character? I mean, Claire's character, was that something that you found through research, maybe letters? How did you create her?
Hmm. Well, something's echoing. All of the four characters were all original to Marcus's original drafts, and so those were characters that Marcus had brought to life, and then those are characters that we continued to flesh out through the backstory, through the coming of age, and just through our drafts as we continued to go. Her character is more fictional, but she represents the girlfriends who were left at home.
I had interviewed Catherine Phillips Singer, pardon me. She had been featured in Ken Burns' The War. Her little brother was Sid Phillips, who had fought in the Pacific, and Sid Phillips had been featured in HBO's The Pacific. So I had met Sid through historian Adam Makos. I had interviewed Sid, and then Sid said, "Hey, you want to meet my sister?" And I'm like, "Absolutely." So Catherine was really great in providing a lot of that home front story. And what did it feel like when your little brother goes off to war, or your boyfriend, or your fiance, or your father, or your uncle? And so there was really an important war that happened at home. It really was, in many ways, a united effort, although not solely. But there really was this, according to Catherine, this real feeling in the continental United States that we've got to do something. We've got to unite. This job done. We've got integration. And so, yeah, she was great to talk to. Very feisty in her late 80s when I spoke with her, and very clear-minded. And she helped provide a lot of the kind of the fodder for the her character.
Sid makes a quick cameo in the book. Sid Phillips does, and so does actually Joe Johnson, who's the bugler. He was the company, the 14-year-old kid, the kid who lied about his age. He became the company bugler. But he has a cameo in there too. We just briefly, but if you look, you'll see them. Because Sid was also from Mobile, Alabama. Is it bugler or bugler, Marcus?
He played the bugle.
He played the bugle. He was
That's
the
the way
bugle
to get
guy.
around it.
Bugler. Now, how did you, so then from this person, Sid, is how you made these characters all in Alabama.
They were originally in Alabama, right?
I think they were originally in Tuscaloosa.
Tuscaloosa.
Yeah, we said Mobile after a while. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can't remember the reason for that, but I like the way it worked out. But I can't remember the reasoning behind that. It's been so many years in process here that I can't remember.
We had to get them to the coast or something.
Yeah.
There's something about a good sort of southern, southern novel, like, why not set it in the South? Yeah.
There's a good source there who she's actually a forensics expert, but she's a person who provides author support to various authors, including thriller authors, you can imagine, because of her forensics background. But she and her mom were both from Mobile, Alabama, and so they were fabulous sources as far as, these are the high school rivalries, and this is where the boys would have gone crabbing, and and you can hear the alligators, and the detail was just phenomenal. So we're very lucky that we had her and her mother too to ask questions of, and she's the one. There's a jubilee in the book, which is when the conditions are right and the fish come up for air, and you can run out and you can grab like anything from crabs to flounder, and she's the one who was instrumental in saying, hey, you know, maybe there's a jubilee. And so there is a jubilee in the book too. Just for fun. Because you got to have some fun stuff in between all the heavy war stuff.
That's actually a good point that Tosca raises there. And we discussed this for really months at a time. But when you're writing about a subject matter that is so dark, it's hard just to have nothing but dark, right? Just dark, 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 dark. So we wanted to intersperse that with some light, which kind of gives the reader a chance to come back up for air, take a breath, and back and immerse yourself in history again. So that was one of the reasons for the alternating timelines. That was one of the reasons that we tried to infuse humor into the book whenever we could. The romance, although it's true to history, where you know so many sweethearts were separated by war, it also did some some lightness to the story. So it does achieve that. It's not too much difficulty, sort of ad infinitum here for air.
It's a bit of a double-edged sword too, because adding that backstory also raises the stakes for the reader, because now they're more vested in these characters whom they've watched grow up and watched have all these, fun adventures, and, hopefully the reader has come to care for them and fall in love with them. And so now it's even more important that they hopefully survive. So.
And I found it quite an interesting, like we talked about the relationship between Jimmy and Claire quite a bit, what that should look like. And Jimmy is kind of this everyman. He represents just the all-American kid who goes off to war. Whereas Hank is kind of the bad guy, or not the bad guy, but the bad boy. And then, Billy represents sort of sweetness and innocence and should not be there in the first place. And so it was the two friends are super good friends, and then they kind of look at each other and go, hey, there's a spark here. I think that's a really kind of a fun dynamic that happens a lot in real life. Sometimes we're sort of bowled over by the person who eventually becomes our significant other, and then other times it happens more slowly and through kind of the genuine outworkings of friendship. So that's really kind of a fun bit to the story.
You also brought in the fact that Jimmy didn't want to stay in Mobile, Alabama. He wanted to see the world. He wanted to, do something better than just live in his old town. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something that a lot of people felt like, you made it real. That.
Thank you. Yeah, in addition to being a war story, it's really a story about, it's a story about hope, and it's a story about redemption. And it's a story where it's not just Jimmy and not just his friends who are having these hopefully character arcs, but even Jimmy's dad and, other people in the story are also going through their times of challenge and change, so that hopefully even our secondary characters are changed at the end as well.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. The question really is, why do young men, young women these days sign up to fight in a war? What's the motivation? And like I had grown up watching MASH, TV's MASH, Hawkeye and BJ and Margaret Houlihan and all these characters. And it's a great show, whatever. But MASH really it's a 1970s sort of cynical response to Vietnam that is sort of overlaid on top of the Korean War. And so you're not getting necessarily actual viewpoints of what happened during the Korean War. You're getting the viewpoints of what happened during Vietnam. So one day I was talking with Lieutenant Compton about MASH, actually, and asked him if he enjoyed it. And he said, yeah, you know, it was a fun show, no worries about it. He said, you have to realize that during World War II, there wasn't kind of this great sense of we're trying to get out of the army, because that was really the theme of MASH, right? We hate being here, we all want to go home. Klinger's wearing a dress, let's get out of here. And Lieutenant Compton said, yeah, you know, there's this attitude in our country like that had been attacked. Our country had been attacked, and so if we were going to defend it, was going to defend it. It was our job. So Buck talked about how he respected the army, although it was difficult experiences, but he felt like he had to do his job. And so we were trying to convey some of that, like the three boys in our book, they sign up for various reasons. But yes, there was a sense of duty. There was sometimes a sense of adventure, particularly before Pearl Harbor. Like Joe Johnson, that was one of the big reasons that he signed up. It's like, yeah, I just kind of want to see the world. I'm a young kid, and this is my chance. Sometimes with some boys, particularly if they'd grown up in impoverished conditions, the army was a job. It was 3 hots and a cot, as they talked about. So it wasn't like everybody was trying to get out of the army. It's one of the things that we were trying to convey as well.
They were also, it also shows how naive they were, and that they were responding to sort of a romanticized, you know, John Wayne, rah, rah, you know, all America kind of point of view about the war, because I think you mentioned that they never expected to, you know, be in a conflict.
Yeah. And the crazy thing for me is, as we're working on this, and then as it comes out, I have 4 stepchildren, and the youngest 2 are twins. And this book came out in May, and my twins were 18. And I'm looking at them and thinking, this is the same age as our characters, as our main character. And it's impossible for me to think of, you know, my twins being in those shoes. But yeah, so that was kind of a weird little thing that happened during that time.
Naive for sure, many of them. In Joe Johnson's story, you know, it's pushed so far over the edge because Joe was so young when he went in. He's 14 years old when he enlists. He is 5'7" and weighs about 135 pounds at age 14. After he goes through everything, after he fights in the battle, after he is a prisoner of war, by the time he finally gets out and is released from the POW camps, sent home, he is 19 years old. He's 6'4", weighs 109 pounds.
Jeez.
So the point is, yeah, he goes through all his formative teenage years in trauma, and yet he's still this growing boy. You know, how he ever got enough nutrition to grow as tall as he did, but very much boy, growing boy.
Young, yeah.
You know, it's definitely a time that we've gone past, because now with modern communications, it would have probably taken a long time for letters to come back and things like that. So when you say they romanticized it, it's because they may not have gotten news from the fronts to see how bad it was. Like that now, we can see something's going on in the Ukraine, and we're seeing it like within minutes. So
Yeah.
Well, so much of their news happened in those reels before movies too. So you're seeing it in the movie theater. So I could see how that would be romanticized, actually. And I think all of that, Marcus, tell me if this is right, but I think all those reels that are coming out in the front of movies they're passed through the Office of War Communications. And so they are very romanticized, I think.
Yeah, they are slanted for sure.
Mhm.
Discuss casualties of war.
Oh, discuss?
Discuss casualties of war.
So, any other questions?
So earlier I had asked Marcus, so is this going to become a film, movie?
I think that'd be so great if it did. You know, there's so few movies about this, and
Oh, casualties. Yeah, yes.
ESUA.
the ones that were generally earlier on. There haven't been a lot of real recent ones. It'd be, I think it'd make a great movie, but I'm biased, so. But I wish it would too, just so that more of us would be able to learn more about that particular theater of World War II. I mean, because like I said, you know, when Marcus called me up that day, I didn't know anything about it. I mean, I knew about Midway and I knew about, you know, some other, but I didn't know anything about the Philippines.
Unfortunately now, I was going to say, unfortunately now when I talk to students, they know less and less about, you know, the conflicts. Their sense of history is so skewed and so limited, you know. Something like your book would bring it to life, hopefully, for these kids.
Yeah, we certainly hope so. When I go to these air shows and book signings and whatnot, and I can't tell you how many people come up to me and say, you know, my grandson needs to read this, or my son, or my daughter, my granddaughter, and there's a real repeated theme that I hear from people that we really want the next generation to understand that they have been, we have all been given much, that many people have done much for us, so that we could enjoy the freedoms we have.
The most important part of the book, I thought, was the pastor, how he was against the war and how he was almost fighting with his son not to be in the service, and how when he comes back, he accepted him with everything, and also that there was a divorce going on between he and his wife at the same time, and the kid didn't know it. That was well done in the book, because we don't really know what's going on with our parents, and we leave to go to the service, because most of us who have been in the service left home when they were 18 or 19 recently, and most of the time there wasn't a war going on. So the part that the war happened after they were in the service is an important aspect that you brought out, and how everybody had to address it, especially between Korea and Vietnam. There was a period of time that people went into service, never saw the service, and other people were stuck with the service and had to be in a real war and had their lives affected by all of a sudden Vietnam coming around, who thought Korea was the last war, and now it's a joke getting trained and whatnot, and just having a time at camp when you go for advance and the original training. You don't really think about war while you're in the service until you stop painting footlockers. The way I looked at it.
We did want to communicate the difficulties in communication for the boys at the front, and particularly if they were, you know, incarcerated in these POW camps. Boy, getting news from home was golden if it ever could happen. Very, very rare. And there's also, you know, a spiritual theme there where we wanted to talk about, you know, people on the home front and some of their community support they felt, and was the religious experience a part of their lives, or, you know, sort of right or wrong. So we do address these themes as well. And was it Jane who just messaged me and said discuss casualties of war? It was a great question as well, because casualties of war, they were not only physical casualties, but they were the mental casualties. And of course, coming back home and this experience of PTSD that was just so widespread. I interviewed a number of the families of veterans and asked them how their father had been affected or two. And I heard a lot of stories, sort of the bad and the ugly, just all blend together. That generation's drug of choice was alcohol, most likely. And so a number of the veterans did cope by succumbing to alcohol abuse, and that caused any number of problems within the family structure and outside. And yet, many of the veterans did kind of pull out of this as they continued forward. When they first came home, there was the attitude that nobody really wanted to hear our stories. A number of veterans and family members kind of expressed this. We had just won the war, it's happy days, it's time for getting on with life. We buy that refrigerator, that house, and settle down and have 2.5 kids. And so when tense experiences have, and people don't talk about them, sort of keep them bottled up for years and years, boy, that gets to explosive levels. It's a good lesson for all of us as well. If we've been through hard times or trauma, go talk about it. Counselor, a therapist, a friend, family members. Let's hear these stories. Let's get them out. And so, yeah. As the decades went on, that theme was kind of reversed, and later on, there is now more of a theme that is, let's hear your stories. We want to hear these stories. We want to read. What did you go through? I encourage anybody, if veteran, sit down, buy him lunch, buy her lunch, and say, what did you go through? Tell me as best you can.
Too few of us have any connection with the military today, because it's less than 0.1% that seems to be in the military.
Yeah, it's an education, I think, for a number of people. What does the military actually do? I know in my own life, for instance, I grew up in Canada, and so I came across to the United States when I went to university, an American. I am years later, but it was a big education for me to find out that the American military does much more than fight. It's not necessarily only a defensive force either. If there is a humanitarian crisis somewhere around the world, it's often the military that's the first responders in that case, and they bring mercy ships out and hospital ships. So the American military is a force for good, can be a force for good.
It's also a force where the kid leaves school because he's immature. At a later time, if he stays in the service, he finds out he can't stay in the service except by going to school.
Same as Irving, lives in Valley Shane. Jane bumps into him every now and again.
Okay.
He's a good lawyer.
Yeah. Why does your name keep coming up?
I don't know.
Okay, we're going into almost the hour now. So if anyone has any last questions for Marcus or Tosca, that would be great. And then I appreciate that they took the time to speak to us, and it was very fascinating. So I'll open the floor to anybody who'd like to say any words.
I haven't finished the book yet, but I intend to. But in looking at the discussion guide, it mentioned chapter 41, I think. So I did read ahead and saw that one sentence. So I have to ask, what was the thought behind having a chapter of only one sentence?
I think that that can be really effective, because sometimes one sentence can carry the weight of many more words. And so, you know, I know the chapter you're talking about, and I think it's just one of those moments where there's no other action, there is only this moment. And so on paper, how do you portray that? And you can portray it by just that much white space and then that short little sentence, because the moment stands on its own, and it's so profound on its own.
Thank you. Any other last comments then?
The book was excellent. I thought it did the job that the military is trying to do now. Tell the people that you can have a brotherhood in the military also. Not exactly like going to church. It's close. The friendships you make in the military are sometimes closer than the ones that you have in your family. The only way I can look at it, because it's true.
Mm-hmm. I've heard that. And that makes absolute sense too.
Barbara, Jane, Lorraine, do you have anything else you'd like to add before we say goodnight?
No, I mean, I love the character development back and forth, so that you could really understand where these guys came from and the dynamics of their relationship. It really very interested, just when there's all this war and it's like, oh my God, was it really that bad? And then you go back to their town in Alabama and it's like, it's relaxing.
Mm-hmm. There were, the war was so bad that there were things that we could have included, but we didn't want to beat the reader up too much. So, I mean, because we're talking about 4 years of stuff. 4 years.
My father fought in the South Pacific, and the only thing he ever told us was that they dropped the atom bomb on his birthday. That's how he woke up on his birthday.
Wow.
And he was asleep, and he woke up and he was like, what the heck is that? He learned.
And which birthday was that?
I don't know, but he went to the South Pacific the day after he graduated high school.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that everyone that I know served in the South Pacific went straight from high school. So I got, as I was listening to you guys talking, I was thinking that every person I knew, every one of my uncles served in the South Pacific, my father and all his younger brothers. And they all went straight out of high school. And all the people I knew who served in the South Pacific were the real young guys.
That's because they volunteered. They didn't know what they were getting into.
Mm-hmm. I think there were a couple things that were going on. I mean, there in some of the accounts, they knew that a draft was imminent and they wanted to be able to choose which branch they went into and what, they wanted to have a choice in the matter. So I read some of that, and then, you're coming out of the Depression, and so, and there was a scarcity of jobs too. So it was a good option for many young men.
Also at that time when they were graduating high school, they were, it was also everybody they knew that was older was in the war. They were in Europe, and their older relatives. And they also were very interested in the GI Bill coming out of, because that's what happened with my father and his brothers. They only served one term. They each served in a different branch. And every one of them, when they came out of service, they went to college.
Well, I want to thank Marcus and Tosca for taking the time to speak to us. And we'll look forward to seeing you. Your next book is coming. It's going to be not another collaboration. You're both working on separate books now.
Yep, Marcus has Marcus has written like 3 books this year or something. He's like, I'm such a slacker compared to Marcus. He's done like 3 and I'm like, okay, I guess I should write one now.
Lawyer. He's on a roll.
Stay tuned.
We really, really appreciate all of you reading this book. And if you enjoyed it, and it's weird saying that about a war book, about a book that was about a terrible war, but if you enjoyed it, the best thing you can do is recommend it to somebody. So, but we really, truly appreciate you taking the time to read this story.
Well, I knew it was going to be good because all the books that Mamie finds for us are great books.
Yes, yeah, very
They're
nice.
books that I would never have otherwise taken out and read. So I've been, she's really the realm of reading for me.
We are big fans of librarians.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. In doing research, sometimes I hit a wall, and when I do, I call a librarian, and they can get places that I can't. So a librarian is your best friend.
Well, we wouldn't be here without the authors to write those books. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to stop the recording. We'll get that up hopefully shortly then.